You could bleep me.
We'll work it out. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday Podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Al Williams.
This is episode 307, CNC tattoos, the big chill in space, and PCB things. This week in the news, take it away.
Well, we've certainly all been talking about whether we're going to be able to get our cheap toys from China or not. And I think the consensus is we don't really know. Earlier this week, we heard the U.S. Post Office was no longer going to accept packages from China until they worked out how to do it. And then almost immediately, within 6 hours, they went, oh, no, actually, we are going to accept packages. We got to figure out how to collect this new tariff that's on it. You know, as somebody who buys a lot of stuff from overseas, as we all do these days, you have to wonder what it's going to mean for you day to day. I read, and I can't say where I read it because I don't remember, but I read that there's about 30 million packages from China entering the U.S. every day. Even if you think that's work days, that's 150 million packages a week. And I'm going to guess, most of the stuff I get from China is worth about $10, right? So somehow
Right.
You need to collect your dollar from that or less sometimes, and sometimes a little more. But, it seems like the cost of picking up the, 40 cents and change and the enforcement of it is going to outweigh any financial benefit. Now, I'm sure you could argue, there's other agendas here, not just the financial part of it, but just the sheer burden of collecting on 30 million packages a day at those small levels. It'd be different if you say, well, there's 30 million packages a day and we're going to collect $20 a piece off of them, sure, but 20 cents is a different proposition, right?
I was shocked. I've been living in Europe for the past 12 years, 13 years now. I've been living in Germany, and I am amazed that the de minimis exemption is $800. Do you know what the de minimis exemption level is in Europe?
Probably 10 euro or something.
23. 23 euros. Yeah.
I almost said marks, but I caught myself, yeah.
10,000 lira. So if you get, a small package shipped to you from China, it's no problem. It slips right under. But anything more than that, you have to do the whole customs forms. And boy, I've run afoul of German customs more times than I care to admit. We are not friends. Numerous packages sent to me have spent a week's vacation in either Frankfurt or Leipzig in the customs office over there. Speaking of the differences between Europe and America, the other one is that America has SuperCon and Europe has Hackaday Europe coming up March 16th. Head on over to Hackaday, get yourself some tickets right now. I'll throw links in the show notes.
What a brilliant segue.
Wasn't that solid? And we'll probably be announcing speakers next week, so stay tuned for that.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Let's do some What's That Sound? This week is a Guess the Sound week, which means we're going to play a sound. Al's going to take a guess. You're going to take a guess. You're going to head on over to hackaday.com/podcast, fill in your guess, and next week we'll figure out among the right answers who gets a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt.
That is I don't know if it's
That's congratulations.
I have to get it eventually, right?
I liked it because it was so musical.
Yeah, and I've heard that many times, done a lot of I
Let
have
me
enough
see what it
software
was.
here. I could actually tell you what it said if you'd give me 10 minutes, but yeah.
Well, I think we've given people more than enough clues. Head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. Scroll on down to What's That Sound. Fill out the form with your best guess for next week, and we will pick randomly among the right answers for a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt.
I'm going to predict you're going to need a large-sided die to roll for the next one. I think a lot of people are going to know that one.
Well, let's start up the hacks. This week, I wanted to start off with hacking the SR08 Smart Ring with built-in display. This is another kind of small consumer electronics hack by Aaron Christoffel. This one is the SR08 ring. You should have a look at it. It's a little Bluetooth ring with an LED display that talks to your cell phone. I guess it can tell you the time and, do limited announcement things. It's also got a little spot on it that serves as a capacitive sense button. And so he wanted to know what kind of foolery he could get up to with this thing. actually looking at it in his video, it's practically inviting it. You can actually see all of the electronics through the little epoxy case that it's in, and enough so that you could tell what microcontroller it has even without opening the thing. Even more so, of course, you can see the debug pins, and that is just asking for trouble. And so one of the first things Aaron does is mill off some of the epoxy, try to get at the debug pins. He actually even pulls one of the little flex PCBs that they're on out of its encapsulation. No luck with any of the above. What I thought was kind of funny here is that it's, normally when we go to hacking on devices, especially if it's a security device, one of the best things you can do instead of hacking on them in the wild is to just pick one up over eBay. These things, he picked them all up over eBay. He couldn't get into them. What does he do? He goes to the manufacturer and gets the official dev kit for the microcontroller in question. And that helped a lot. So he was able to develop his firmware and practice his flashing of the little chip, which is, I guess it's a Renesas DA14585 microcontroller. It's a little BLE microcontroller. The ring has more memory on it than the dev kit, so he has to solder extra memory on there and change some things in the bootloader. Playing around with it, he does not have high praise for the ease of use of the dev kit or the Renesas, their whole tool chain. But at the end of the day, he is able to simply just write new firmware and flash it to these rings using a cell phone app that, his cell phone connects to it, SUOTA app. You can get it on the Play Store, and it uploads new firmware to the device over BLE. So it's actually a really sweet transaction there. And in his GitHub, Aaron's kind of documented all the pinouts for this thing and given you an Eclipse tool chain so you can write your own code for it. Think he's done with it there, but he's set you up if you want to play with this thing. And again, it's got a nice numeric LED display. It's able to speak Bluetooth, and it's got a button. What do you want to do with it?
Yeah, I was asking myself that too. I mean, this is super cool just from a thought experiment standpoint, but I'm thinking, well, how much smaller can you make something before it's just not useful, I have a little battery and a programmable LED, and it's the size of a grain of rice. Okay, well, okay, good. What am I going to do with it? I don't know. I have enough problems coming up with reasons to use my smartwatch without having a ring now on top of it. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just an outlier and I don't understand what that's for. But, what's the next step down? Smart earring?
If there was one, that's pretty cool.
Well, I mean, if you could do a smart ring, I would think you could make a smart earring.
I actually totally agree with you. Like, what would I do with this? It's a little display and a button that connects to Bluetooth. You could write cell phone apps for it and do interesting things. I don't even know what they do on their own. What is the intended use case of this device, much less what's the hacked one going to be? And I think that's kind of where Aaron ends up on this. I think he's figured out how to own the thing, flash the thing, done a little reverse engineering on the software they had, and, can, again, non-destructively flash his own firmware to the thing. He could flash the manufacturer's firmware back to it as well. I think that's lovely, but I don't know what I'd do with this device either. What I really like about it, though, is that it is kind of left entirely open like that. And you could imagine that they could have required signed binaries or, taken all sorts of security measures here. But given that it's Bluetooth low energy, you have to be in basically close proximity to the device to reflash it. I don't know if you have to do something special to get it in bootloader mode or not. You may have to hold the button down. Who knows? It's a pretty low risk surface. And so I'm pretty stoked that they just left it open for the regular over the air flashing, because it does mean that it's hackable. And so, assuming that whatever the manufacturer's apps are don't float your boat, you can write your own.
Can't have much battery life, right? The battery's got to be the size of a Rice Krispie or something.
Oh, the batteries in these things are awesome. I was at a trade show and I saw the little lithium-ion batteries that they make to put in these rings, and they're crescent-shaped batteries already. They fit the ring exactly straight out of the factory. They're really cool.
And that doesn't change by size? I would think it just depends on the size, wouldn't it, or no? It'd be funny if you had to get your battery sized as well, right? I do size 5 battery. Oh, we only have 6.5. Sorry. If they had some Bluetooth low energy equivalent of NFC that was in widespread use, I could think of a lot I'd want to do with that, right? I want to tap my ring and get onto the metro, or I want to tap my ring and pay for my Coke, or tap my ring and open my access door to the garage, or log into Google or whatever. That'd be great. But we can't hardly do that with NFC now without having, I got to have this one for this door and this one for the Metro and this one for that. That's tough enough. But I don't know of anything like that with BLE. So unless it had all the NFC hardware in it, which I'm not even sure you could fit that in a ring, to be honest with you, I don't know that that's feasible. But that's about the only use case I could think of. And even then, that's just, that's a first world problem, is I don't want to pull my NFC card out of my pocket.
But that's not a bad idea. You could use it as a password containing device. Send your one-time password over Bluetooth to whatever devices you're authenticating with, like a passkey sort of thing. That'd be all right.
Okay, well, I picked a fun one to start with this week. Emily, the engineer, had, it was one of these things that you probably, if you thought about it for a minute, would go, oh yeah, I guess that would work. But it was a very amusing video. A friend of hers wanted an automated tattoo, so she took a 3D printer and put a tattoo gun on it, and, you can make up the rest in your head, and it's probably correct. I got to tell you, I'm not, I don't know that I'm brave enough to just, especially somebody else, right? It's kind of like jumping out of a plane. I've always said, I think if I took enough classes and read up enough and I got to pack the parachute and all that, I could jump off a plane. But the idea of getting on a plane and saying, hey, stranger, how about strapping me to your back and you jump out of the plane, right? That's never going to happen. Never. So I'm not sure. I could probably have done this if I did the work, right? But to say, hey, why don't you build this 3D printer tattoo gun and you can put it on my leg and let's see how it works, right? I think, though. You can only hope they tattooed a chicken breast or something before they did it on his leg. But they did do it on his leg. Kind of ISO 9000-ish, because they labeled his leg, right? They tattooed leg on his leg. I'm sure there's some standard compliance in there. I assume the title graphic on the video where she's tattooed "No Regrets" on her arm is photoshopped. I'm going to guess that. In the end of it, it really isn't much of a rocket science project. I mean, tattoo gun, 3D printer, it's basically making a plotter with a needle instead of a pen. It was a fun video. And, it does get you to think that might be a good Hackaday contest for us, Elliot, as the, best repurpose of a 3D printer, right? What can you take an off-the-shelf 3D printer and make it do that makes us go, ooh, wow, that's weird, or wow, that's cool, or whatever. So it seems like that ought to be a contest this year.
Oh, that's a good one. I like it. This is the half of the engineer part, right? Like, half of this is crazy stunt, and the other half is she bought some fake skin and tattoo ink and, a legit tattoo gun and did some test runs and tested it out. So there's all of that going on in the video too. I still wouldn't do it on my own leg. That's crazy talk. But you're right. And she even says it. She's like, so what do we do to turn this thing into a tattoo gun? Well, we need 2 axes of motion. So we've got a 3D printer. We just need 1 fewer degree of freedom. And I'm like, yeah, well, there you go. What, she even added a pneumatic safety release? You could flip the switch and it shoots the tattoo gun up. Although demoing it to someone, she actually does it in reverse. She plunges it deeper in by accident, which couldn't possibly happen in the real scenario, but makes for a good demo.
Yeah, that's why I wanted the chicken breast. I saw the artificial skin, but I'm still not a believer. So
really, they had this mock-up where they had artificial skin over a ball wedged up against this like holder thing that they have for the guy's leg so that he doesn't move during the tattoo. None for me.
It's too much like Clockwork Orange, I think so. But yeah, not really a big thought piece there, but I just thought it was fun and thought we'd get a good laugh out of it. So
plotting with 3D printers, put a pen on your 3D printer and mess around with plotting is a super fun thing to do. Doesn't have to be a tattoo gun. You can be regular ink on a piece of paper, but opens up all sorts of art fun.
Or do a soldering iron and do wood burning the old-fashioned way, right, instead of with a laser. So there you go. I think I've seen that. I don't think I saw that or I dreamed it. I don't know which. I'll have to look that up.
All right, my next hack is, actually, it was a long-form article, but I wanted to cover it here. A closer look at the Tanmatsu from Jenny List. Jenny's in the Netherlands where this device was developed and got a first hands-on with it. So if you're at all curious about it, you should head on over. What it is, it was originally designed as a conference badge for the Dutch Hacker Camp this summer, but my God, it's an elaborate hacker badge. So much so that it's got a custom keyboard It's got a screen. It's got a computer running a stripped down version of Linux. It's got a LoRa radio. The whole thing is sandwiched together using PCBs on the front and the back. It's a sweet, sweet design. It is not what you think of when you think of conference badges. It's more what you think of when you think little computer. And I think that's what's awesome about it. It's kind of in that weird space between a device that's made with a microcontroller and a device that's made with a full computer. And so it's going to have better battery life than like a Raspberry Pi in a handheld, and probably be, more easily hackable. It's got a nice little header on it, but at the same time, it's kind of much more complicated than a badge. It's a little computery pocket goofing around thing. I think it's the sort of thing that only a hacker would love, but I think it would be kind of fun to play around with.
Yeah, it looked super great. And of course, we've seen a couple of things like this, but maybe not quite to this level of fit and finish. I couldn't help but think of the basic one 3 or 4 years ago. But of course, it didn't look nearly that nice on the keyboard. I think what I'm always struck by, though, I mean, this is great. Where is the killer one of these that just wipes everybody out of the market? And I haven't seen it, right? So if you think about it, there was a time when you would have said, oh, we're getting ready to do a project. We better go evaluate these different boards. And now, unless it's something very exotic, you just go get an Arduino board because that's what, maybe it's got a 32-bit processor on it. Maybe not an 8-bit Arduino, but still. Or if you need something that runs Linux, you don't go, oh, let me go through this big process to figure it out. You just go grab a Raspberry Pi. There's all these applications where you need a keyboard, a screen, a battery, and wireless connectivity, but there's 50 things that do that, and I haven't seen anybody that's won at that yet, right? Where you just go, oh yeah, that's the obvious choice is the, Gridsbic 422 or whatever the model number would be on it. I don't think this is it either, maybe, but it's certainly nice, and I always am curious about that, why we don't see more people at least attempting to be the 50,000-pound gorilla in that space.
I think it's a small enough space. Like who needs a small hacker device like this? Kind of.
But I think you're thinking about it wrong. It's not a hacker device. I think what you want is a platform, right? You want to say, here's a screen, a keyboard, a rechargeable battery, wireless connectivity, preferably in a module so I could flip it in and out. And there are some products like that. I mean, I'm not just saying, I've invented this, but there's not one that if you ask 10 people, we need something to build something that's got that form factor, and 8 of them are going to go, oh yeah, you should use that thing, right? Whereas if you said, I need a little Linux box with a network connection, 8 people out of 10 are going to say, just go get a Raspberry Pi and be done with it, call it a day, right? And I don't know why that is.
Yeah, the keyboard on this is actually really sweet. Turns out I have held one of these in my hands. I didn't know it at the time. The keyboard is designed by Arturo 182. And man, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, he was working on the adapters for the BlackBerry keyboards, which were new old stock BlackBerry keyboards, were available cheap. They've become so popular in hacker projects now that they're not cheap anymore, and the supply's drying up, and they cost a heck of a lot of money. And so Arturo was like, well, I'll design my own keyboard then, and went down that rabbit hole of getting the dies made for the silicone form and learning about, when you get one of those keyboard matrices printed out on a PCB, they have these overlay stickers that have all the little metal domes in them. And it's actually just applied down as a solid sticker over it. And then the hard part is basically the rubbery keys on top of that and making sure they feel nice and all that, right? So I was playing with he was showing me his device and was like, hey, look at this. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And it turns out it was this thing, or at least a very early prototype of exactly this board. I can vouch for the keyboard being actually quite pleasant to use.
The BlackBerry keyboard was joyful, of course. I'm always surprised at how often we being engineers or hackers, will say, oh, who cares? But in fact, anything that you touch all the time is insanely important. So remember all the old computers that came out in the 80s and they were like, oh, let's just cheap out and have these flat keyboards, or things like that. It's like, that was always the death knell if your computer didn't have at least some reasonable keyboard. Just recently, I've been playing with vertical mice, and I've got about 5 of them in here. And there's one of them that I don't know what it is. There's the plastic in it is kind of like a Logitech MX. It's real heavy. It feels good. And then there's another one that works just as well. It's perfectly fine, but I don't know. The plastic doesn't feel right, right? It just isn't. I can't even explain it. Here, I'm going to grab it right now. It's not smooth. It feels very thin and lightweight. It almost feels like I don't know why, but it reminds me of like the plastic you find in a pack of cookies, right? The cookies are in the little plastic tray, and I don't like it, right? I just don't like it, and I got to hold it 18 hours a day, the way my life is. And so these things like keyboard feel and mouse feel, that seems like, oh, who cares? But in fact, you really, really care. So yeah, good job on the keyboard.
That's the missing link too. Like, I think that was part of the reason that Arturo's BlackBerry keyboard project was so successful, is that that's just, we make so many little devices, and making a keyboard is well out of reach. Oh, I actually remember Brian Benchoff ages ago had a keyboard project that he wanted to start down, and I think he went as far as to get the molds spec'd out, and then they were insanely expensive. And that's, that ends up being the problem, is that these things are cheap when they're in quantity 10,000 or 100,000, but if they're in quantity 10 or 100, they're insanely expensive. And so you kind of have to commit to getting a lot made to make it worth your while. And so that was what was really cool about Arturo's BlackBerry project, was that it just ripped off a keyboard that, at least for a while, felt really good and you could get cheaply on the used/new old stock market.
My next hack is Levi Jansen. This is one of those cases where it's electroplating DIY PCBs vias at home without chemical baths. And I think this is one of those cases where his results were maybe not as good as you would hope, and is probably not as good as he hoped as well. But I love the out-of-the-box creative thinking, and I'm still hopeful that he's going to figure out a way around the problems. As you know, vias are the little connections that go from usually the top to the bottom of a PC board, if you're doing 2 layers at least. And how do you make those at home? Well, the answer is usually you have a hole and you solder some wires, one on top and one on the bottom, and you call it a day. Or I've seen people use rivets. But of course, as people are getting more sophisticated in making PC boards, they want them to look more like the real boards. And so people have been trying to figure out how to electroplate vias. Jansen wanted to do that with his new CNC manufacturing machine project, but he didn't want to have some messy vat of chemicals. So he kind of set out to see if he could, in fact, coat the via with a conductive ink and then kind of electroplate in place, which sounds like a kind of clever new idea. But in fact, we've seen electroplating pins and stuff that, you just kind of swipe electroplate on. They're usually not very good, but they're good enough. And he actually got it to work. I mean, so it's not like it didn't work, but here's the problem. Electroplating is slow, right? So a 0.3 millimeter via took 10 minutes to electroplate, and that was even by cranking up the voltage beyond what I think was probably wise. So how many vias do you have on your board? Well, 50? Okay, that's 500 minutes of electroplating time. Whereas you can throw it in the bath, and it's the parallel processing of PC board manufacturing, right? You do all the holes at one time. So I think it's maybe not a practical solution today. He did mention that he's got some things he wants to try, and so I'm anxious to see what he comes up with. But even if this never works, what a great exploration of a out-of-the-box idea. I don't want to say solution because that sounds like the bath again, but out-of-the-box idea to say, hey, I don't want the big vat of chemicals. What else can I do? So I enjoyed it from that standpoint. Plus, I just fantasize over having the machine where I, stick an SD card in with my Gerber files and a PC board falls out of it an hour later. That's my goal.
Well, speaking of alternate ways to get things done, our next one's a video by Berm Peak, who's normally a bicycle reviewer. This one, Bicycle Adds Reliability with Second Chain, is the story of the Buffalo S2 utility bike. And the original Buffalo was a very heavy-duty bike meant to, I guess they were given to villages in Africa. They're super heavy-duty bikes meant to carry heavy weights around. So if you don't have car and good road infrastructure, you can carry your stuff on the back of one of these. I think they said like 150 pounds rated on the rear rack. So pretty heavy duty and meant to take a real beating. The problem is, of course, that the original Buffalo just had one speed. going uphill with 150 pounds on the back of your bike is hard. So that gets us to the Buffalo version 2 here, which has, well, more than one gear. It has 2 speeds. Does it in the strangest way I've ever seen, in kind of the name of reliability and easy serviceability. The bike has 2 chains. It's like a totally redundant bicycle system with 2 different gearings, and it's got a hub in the back that when you backpedal for a quarter turn, it switches between which set of teeth driving which of the 2 chains is then powering the wheels. So think of those bikes, you know, how you could, when you were a kid, you had a bike that you could back pedal and it would engage the brakes. This one instead switches between the 2 gears when you back pedal. It's a really neat looking interaction. It really makes me want to try one of these out. And the low gear is very low. So your goal is to be able to climb up hills with heavy loads with the thing. The whole point of it, though, is to make it entirely high reliability and kind of, you know, just basically bomb proof. If you think about a regular bike's derailleur, it's this kind of fragile, floppy thing with a bunch of springs in it, and you know, you get sticks in that, it's game over. It hops off the chain. To make those derailleurs work with multiple gears, you have to have thin bike chains that aren't particularly robust. There's a whole bunch of design compromises that led them to this kind of really crazy design, a bike with 2 sets of chains, 2 gears running in parallel, and then a interesting hub that you can backpedal to switch which one's driving. I still am not 100% sure how this works mechanically, but Paul linked us to the patent for it in the comments. So if you want to have a look at it, you know, there's this exploded view of this rear hub assembly thing, switcher. It's got lots of gears and ratchets and pawls in it and stuff like that. Not a mechanical.
Yeah, I was going to say most mechanical things mystify me anyway, so you know, mechanically, it's a clever design. It's always somewhat mystified me that, you know, I can take an electronics problem and visualize how I'm going to solve it. But when I look at stuff like a teletype or this mechanism or lots of other complicated mechanical things, and I think, who started from a blank page and came out with this, right? I have enough trouble understanding it when I'm looking at it and I've got pictures and blow up views and somebody explaining it to me. So I don't really have that knack for saying, oh, we need this motion in this direction to turn into motion in that direction at this different torque. I'm lost. I don't know how to do that. So unless it's something super stupid.
In my head, it's kind of like that clicky mechanism in a pen where you press it one way and a thing shifts over to one side and you press it again and the thing shifts back over. I don't know. What I really want to see is somebody tear this thing apart and give us a super deep dive into how the rear freewheel gear changing thing works. It would be really fun to see. Maybe a 3D animation of it. I think that's
well. I think you should get right on that, Elliot.
Well, we've got the patent. All I have to do is start modeling it, and
there you go.
Yeah.
Okay, my last pick for the week was from Raman Shaber. And he's got custom PCB as a poor man's pick and place. Honestly, you know, this is one of those really good ideas that's not all that, unlike the bike, it's not all that hard to imagine other than you just didn't think about it. You know, we all know you get your PC boards made and you get the stencil made. So he's just get us another panel made that's kind of a template for laying down his parts, helps him get the alignment and all that. And I marvel because, you know, just like we were talking about earlier, 30 years ago, trying to bring stuff in from China, I remember when buying PC boards was horrible, right? And, you know, you had all this NRE fee of, you know, hundreds of dollars. And, you know, that first PC board might have cost you $500 or $600. And then, of course, if it was wrong, that was horrible. Now it's so cheap that if you want a front panel or a little jig to put your parts down with, you can just say, just make another PC board. It doesn't have any conductors on it or anything, but that's cheaper than me going and having it routed out of a piece of aluminum or whatever. But it's really clever. The hot plate is probably the right answer there. But, you know, even if you were trying to do this by hand, you might like get 2 sides down on everything and then pull the template off, you know, and then you could go finish up the soldering. That would probably work too. But what a clever idea. And you're already getting the boards made. You've already got the Gerbers. It's a pretty short path to just have another panel cut out to make that template.
Yeah, and if you're doing it in KiCad, which I think he is here, you have the packages all ready for you too. And like the motivating case here was some of those funny little SMD ribbon cable connectors that have to be super precisely placed if you want to do reflow soldering on them. And, you know, it's an unpopulated PCB that's just got to cut out the exact size of that connector so it holds it in place. I think it's a super clever idea. Again, as long as you've got the digital files for the connector part, and then you can pop that over to a CAD program, boom, you're done.
I wondered, I don't even remember, a while back I did a piece on gluing 3D printed pieces together where I was printing sacrificial ears with holes in them and then using nuts and bolts just to temporarily clamp them together while the glue set. So that got your alignment. And if you did it right, it got your compression. And I wondered here, if you had tabs on the side of the board anyway, if you couldn't have put some holes so that the board would actually just lay over, you'd slip, say 4 M3 bolts through the holes, tighten it down, and now it's a sandwich. It's not just held down with tape. That would have let you get very precise alignment. And then since it's on the tabs, when the tabs come off, the holes are gone, right? So who cares? I don't know if that would be feasible or not. I don't know if the board houses could put holes in your tabs or not, but you'd think they could. I think it's just a score line on a part that they could have done anything with. So I don't know. That was the only thing I could think of to possibly improve this, because you could just get insanely good alignment that way, right?
If you've got mounting holes on it or any other sort of, if you've got a couple through hole parts, like USB connectors or something, anywhere you could put a matching drill hole in the overlay, that would be super easy way to register it, like you're suggesting.
Yeah, that was the only thing I could think of. Otherwise, I thought it was brilliant.
That's super clever. My first quick hack this week comes from McLean. What's the hour? It's XVII o'clock. It's a wristwatch. It's kind of like that word clock that was making the rounds a few years ago, but it's round and it's got Roman numerals. So when it's 12:34, it says it's XII at the top, and then it says it's whatever 34 is.
XXXIV
down at the bottom. Void Electronics, investigating electromagnetic magic in obsolete machines. This is a video explaining the mysterious old piece of technology known as the Synchro or the Selson. I was totally surprised you didn't pick this one, Al, because I know you think these things are really cool. This is a great demo of how they work inside. It's kind of a rotary transformer with the amount of power it puts out across 3 different wires, depending on where the little 3-phase motor coil is turned. That powers another motor in exactly the way you turn this one. The 2 of them turn together. He has the best demo where he hooks 3 light bulbs up to it and turns it, and you can see one get brighter and then dimmer, and then the next one get brighter and dimmer, and you can watch them go all around in phase. Made me finally understand the Synchro. And last up, speaking of looking into things, Big Clive, understanding the T12 style soldering iron tip. Honestly, there's not that much to understand here. It's got a coil of wire that heats things up, and it's got a thermocouple in it. It still is a really cute design to wedge all that up inside a soldering iron tip. Along the way, he points out how it's designed for manufacture and how you would make these things in large numbers if you were selling soldering iron tips to everyone in the world. But I guess since we all use these things every day, I thought it was cool to cut one open and have a look.
MechFlare had the clever design behind everyday traffic poles. And I have to say, I picked this one because I'm embarrassed. I do the column of tech in plain sight. And I've noticed a million times, you see these light poles, they're not really stuck into the ground. They're bolted to a plate that's bolted to a anchor on the ground. And it turns out there's an insane amount of engineering about why that's almost universally true. And that video covers that. Very interesting video. Next up, I had Andy Kong. Andy Kong's been resin printing lenses. And, the resin printing, which I hate because it's smelly and messy, but I do it sometimes. You can print the lens, but no matter how clear you can get your resin and how fine you make the lines, there's still lines. So you have to polish it or do something to get an actually usable lens. One of those somethings they can do is take a little bit of resin, coat the top of it, and then cure it on top of the proto lens, if you will. And Andy came up with some very clever way of doing that involving, of all things, saran wrap. Last but not least, W2PAK has a demo of using one of these little, $12 Baofeng, I think it was a Baofeng, but some Chinese handy-talkie, ham radio, UHF, VHF radio, to talk to a satellite. I really thought this video and the one before it that he did was really clever because he makes a antenna, a very special antenna, out of a piece of, some kind of boom material and essentially some wire and tubing. So it really wasn't very expensive to do. And the handy-talkie actually clamps to the base of it. He goes outside, points it at the sky, and starts talking to people over the satellite using this, basically junk box antenna and a $12 Chinese radio. It's very cool. That's one of the times I read one of those and think, oh, I got to go build one of those. I got to go try that. I get that feeling about 10 times a week, but I usually won't act on it. But this one I may actually act on. I've done satellite stuff before, but this looked so easy. And I was actually looking, I've got a fairly new radio that not only would it work for this, it has you can actually download the Keplers into the radio. It will tell you when the satellite's coming, where it's pointing, and will Doppler shift as it goes over your head all by itself. So I'm like, wow, that's super, super great. I don't think the little $12 cheapie that he has is doing those things, but it's amazing what you can get for less than $100 nowadays.
Well, that brings us to our can't miss articles. These are long form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week, I wanted to pick Lewin Day's What Happens If You Die in Space. Not because this is macabre, but because it's eventually going to happen. We've got lots and lots of astronauts up there, and eventually somebody is going to die of natural causes in space. And it's important to have a plan for it. And what's surprising to me is not that NASA has a plan, but kind of how nebulous and freewheeling the plan is. Well, I say the plan, there have been a couple plans. One of them, the one that Lewin writes the most about, was this plan by Promessa, where they essentially deal with the corpse by putting it outside in the vacuum and cold of space, freeze drying it and shaking it. And this seems really crazy, but you have to think about something like the space station, which is this closed, sealed container. If somebody dies, is it because they were sick? Is it going to be a risk to everybody else on the ship? That is a super important concern. Does the family back at home want the remains back? How are you going to deal with that? There are all these concerns, What psychological effects is this going to have on the remaining astronauts who are up there in the space station? Is it going to be a danger to them? Is it going to be a psychological danger to them? There are all of these problems, and they're kind of dealt with. It's interesting. Lewin picks up this NASA technical brief, mortality related to human spaceflight, and you read it, and normally NASA things are extraordinarily well thought through in all the different cases, and then they kind of come to a conclusion. This one, in the end, it's like, well, it's going to depend on what the flight physician says and what the family wants and, what the cause was and all of this. And it's kind of interesting. They work through a lot of the cases, but there actually is no real one-size-fits-all plan for what happens if somebody passes away on the space station.
So you don't think there'll be a mortician shows up and gives them options? Is that what you're telling me?
That seems to be the case.
We can put you in the aluminum casket for a very good price.
Right.
This is one of the less glamorous aspects of space travel. I think the answer to is the family wants them back. That's probably going to be too bad. I can tell you, I know this for a fact, before you climb Everest, you have to sign a paper that says if you die going up or down the mountain, you will be buried wherever you fell down or not, right? But you're not going home, and you have to
Right.
agree to that. I know somebody who is resting on top of Mount Everest, or maybe not on top, but somewhere. And in fact, by coincidence, he's an astronaut, Carl Nye. So that's probably less of I think that's probably not going to happen. I think they would just say, no, sorry, that's the thing. But I think the really unglamorous part of it is that if you go into the future a little bit and you say, well, I've got the orbiting Mars habitat, or I've got the generation ship going to Alpha Centauri or whatever, where you've really got these closed ecosystems, you can't afford to lose that mass, right? So now you start getting into the really bad things. I mean, it's bad enough when you're up in the station, you got to think about you're drinking the recycled urine, right? That's just you just have to forget about that.
Lewin starts it off with how rare this is. 644 people have been out in space. 18 have died, and they did kind of violently and totally in ways that make this problem, not a problem, right? When the whole spaceship explodes and loses power, there's nobody around to worry about it. But the question about what to do on the ISS if somebody just, has a fatal heart attack, it's a real live question, and it's very interesting. But I agree with you that Chris Hadfield said that they do have death sims so that they have, some preparation for this. But again, I think some of it is just wing it. And to your point of whether they're going to bring the remains back or not, I mean, they say they will take the family's wishes into consideration, but they also say things like, we can't be just bringing stuff back to Earth without going through their regular decontamination routines. They can't, you don't want to bring the horrible space virus back with you either, right? So there are all of these interesting and difficult considerations there. They have to do forensic samples. They have to, confine things and make sure everything's disinfected correctly. And, it's...
Imagine if Apollo 11 had been where you said, they crashed on the moon and they didn't make it. Sorry. That's going to be really ugly. But what would have been uglier is, if you missed the moon and then they just went flying off forever and there was no way to get them back. That's a real PR disaster, because when you blow up, you have just dead heroes, right? When you're just sailing away and you've got 2 weeks, 2 weeks worth of oxygen and food left, and you get the radio home and go, wow, is somebody going to come get us? Well, no, there's no way to get you, that's, forget the other aspects of it, of which it's a horrible tragedy to begin with. But I'm just saying, if you really think you don't want to explain the exploded vehicle, wait till you have to explain that one. And as far as I know, no one's really had to explain that one yet. No one's had protracted, unrecoverable live astronauts yet. That day will have to come one day.
Yeah, the Major Tom scenario just reinforces how brave these people are going out there, especially in the early space program. They knew that was a real possibility, that, something would happen and they wouldn't have fuel to get up off the moon, and that would be that. And the astronauts knew that.
One of the bravest people I ever thought of was Alan Shepard, because, with the track record the rockets had in those days, and you said, hey, Alan, why don't you go climb up on top of that giant thing of explosives, and we're pretty sure it'll blow you up into space, right?
Right? Yeah.
It was a pretty good commitment. It's different now, where you go, oh, yeah, we kind of know what we're doing, and sure, sometimes it doesn't go well, but it's still pretty safe. But boy, back then, it was like, man, that guy had to... Yeah. So
that's what's kind of interesting about this article too, is that it does put it in this context where, you're worrying about the psychology of the other people left on the ISS. You're worried about all of these kind of other secondary concerns that you only start to have once space travel has become pretty darn safe in the first place.
Well, let's hope we don't have to deal with that ever, would be my wish. My pick this week, selfishly, was my own article, Telling Time Used to Be a Ball. And the genesis of this was I spent about a week in Australia. Wasn't writing much for Hackaday when I was in Australia. But one of the things that I did do was I went to the observatory there in Sydney. And there's this tower with a ball on top of it. And they told us that was the time ball. So that got me looking up time balls. I had never heard of this. Maybe I'm the only one. Maybe everyone knew about this. But, the ships at sea needed the time, so they're in harbor. the observatory would sight noon, and then they would, at 1 o'clock at 1300, they would fire a cannon. But of course, you might be so far away that the cannon blast takes some amount of time to get there. So they wanted to have some other way to signal you, and that was what the ball was for. They would start to lift the ball up a couple of minutes before 1. The ball would go all the way up, and then the second the ball started to drop, it would be 1 o'clock. So of course, because you're at the height, they'd really thought this out, right? Because you're at the highest point, the most number of ships are going to be able to see it, right? They're further, even if you're a little further away, you should be able to see the ball. And then the minute it drops, you don't have to be able to see the bottom. You don't care how far down it goes or when it hits the bottom. This is apparently indirectly the genesis of the Times Square ball dropping, although that, of course, is gaudy, takes a minute to land, and it's 12 o'clock when it hits the ground, not when it starts dropping. So it's a little modification on the theme. But I started looking, and these time balls were very common at some point. The Naval Observatory here in the U.S. has one. The observatory in Greenwich has one. Basically, anywhere there was some place that really knew what time it was and had ships nearby had these time balls. And that was just a little piece of history I had never heard of. Some of them, apparently, they're still going, and I thought it was very interesting. I haven't been able to find any information on it, but apparently all over the world, they would sight the sun at noon. They'd set some fairly accurate clock, and then, when the clock said it was 1, they would drop the ball, except in the United States. And somehow in the United States, they would drop the ball at noon. So I don't know if that just meant, they had a guy looking through the telescope with his hand up, and when he dropped his hand, they dropped the ball, or if they could sight 11 o'clock, or I don't know. I'm really not sure what the reasoning for that was, but apparently everyone in the world drops the ball at 1 to give you time to actually go drop the ball. And in the United States, they drop the ball at noon. So I keep hoping somebody understands how that worked, and will explain it in the comments, but so far have not seen it. So how about it, Elliot? Did you know about time balls before you read that piece?
I had no idea. This is bizarre. And why would it go down and not up? And I think the answer is that it's, easier to make the mechanism that drops it.
I think it was line of sight.
Yeah, because maybe you couldn't see it at the bottom, and you want to know exactly when it starts to drop.
Yeah, because you're further away, you'd be able to see the top and not necessarily see the bottom, right?
Right. You only know it's dropping relative to something that isn't dropping, right? I imagine myself far at sea in a boat looking at this thing. You have to also be able to see the mast that it's attached to.
I would think you'd see the mast. You'd have a spyglass on it, and
But I guess you have a good telescope.
You'd see once you start seeing the mast, and how accurate do you have to be? A second probably is pretty good. I don't know.
I assume they were using this to navigate by, and so they need the clocks to be super accurate so that they can figure out where they are. Yeah, a second's probably good. You don't want to be off by a second on the face of the
but you got to figure the clocks probably weren't that accurate, so they were probably, your clock error was swamping out any error in watching the ball. So I'm always fascinated by how people, we think of people in the old days, if you will, of not having any technology, but they had lots of technology. It was just technology they could access, right? There was all sorts of clever things people did back in the day that now we don't do because we have better ways to do it, but they still did it. I had a guide in Pompeii who did that. His name was Enzo, and he would say, thickly accented, he'd say, "Now, I know you don't believe this, but in Pompeii, they actually had GPS," and then he'd show how they would know where they were in town through these marks, right? It wasn't really GPS, but, his point was all these things that we think are modern conveniences, they had them just in different ways. They didn't have a satellite, so they had, marks on the curb or whatever to tell them where they were. This is another case. They didn't have GPS to synchronize their time, so they've got the time ball. Pretty cool.
Well, that wraps it up for this week's Hackaday Podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you see anything cool or do anything cool, drop us a line, tips@hackaday.com. And to follow the links, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And until next week,
keep those hacks coming.
My water is boiling.
Now, there's the outtake piece there. My water is boiling. I think people would really want to know what that meant.
There you go. Can you hear that?
And there's your sound of the week from next week. That's it. You can cut some of that out.
I'm going to have to bleep a whole lot then, I think. I'm not slurping in your audio stream.
Good thing I got my headphones on.
Ribbon caber. Oh, and two.
And if you're hanging around the right place, you're going to hear it whether you're doing it or not, right? I've probably never done it, but I know what it looks like. So
What are PCB things?